Welcome back, this is Goku Sun DBZ, and welcome to a new game review. This time I am looking at an all-time classic survival horror game, arguably my personal favorite survival horror game of all time, and that is Resident Evil 2, specifically for the PS1 version, as that is the only version of the game that I have ever owned. Now, I have played the N64 version, that's quite an interesting experience. But with that said, and I'll allow my assistant Cthulhu to hold the game. But with that said, Silent Hill 1, it's an all-time classic. It arguably took many of the elements that the original Resident Evil, or yes, the original classic Biohazard Resident Evil game, and it would much extend upon it, especially in the domain of storytelling. Now, unfortunately, like the first game, not the greatest English dub voice work, but for the most part, you would end up taking many elements and far surpassing them. But with that said, with Resident Evil 1, it definitely had some positive moments, I would say, though the remake would pretty much take everything and make it far superior. Now, with that said, Resident Evil 2 would take many things we learned in Resident Evil 1, such as the T virus, the or rather zombies, and many other elements, and of course, the first of many different tyrant creatures, or just known as tyrant. And, of course, would be the beginning of a well known antagonist that would go on throughout the franchise. Of course, that being obviously Wesker, as well as many other staple characters, specifically, though, Jill Valentine and Chris Redfield. However, we would get introduced to some interesting characters, and arguably, I think perhaps the most popular character in the Resident Evil franchise would debut in the second game. You would have first the younger sister of course, Chris Redfield, that being obviously Claire Redfield. And even though some people argue that Chris Redfield should be the face of Resident Evil, personally, I have always felt I prefer Leon Kennedy over Chris Redfield. But with that said, Resident Evil 2 would very much improve upon all elements from the first game. The music, superb. And it would definitely keep, I think, a better job at the dread feeling from the first one and the second one. Also, I much preferred creatures that you would face in Resident Evil 2. First, you would see an improved tyrant creature. And of course, he would be considered the prototype, which we would meet the ultimate version of in, of course, the third game, Nemesis. But that is a game for another time. With this one, we would see also the debut of a new, more powerful virus. A much more potent version than the T virus, and of course, that is the G virus, which of course was created by the Great Umbrella Corporation, or rediscovered if you know the mythos of the Resident Evil games up through Resident Evil 8 Village. Then you would understand a few of the elements and things about some of these different version viruses. But the G virus is a key importance and would become a key element for future creatures you would face. But it would be more or less, you could call, I guess, rediscovered or created by, of course, the Umbrella Corporation scientists, and that is, well, a certain special individual. But with that said, we would go on through the police station throughout the game, introduced to new creatures. My personal favorite creature debut in the series would be in this game, and that being, of course, the dreaded and definitely harder to kill than zombie version, and of course, that being other than the liquors, which have definitely become a staple and fan favorite throughout the years, and would even debut in the first live action adaptation RE game, or rather RE film, which I am glad about. Also, of course, we would see zombie dogs, we would see the tarantulas make a return, we would also get to face like almost 100-foot mutant alligator, as well as weird mutant plant creatures in the Umbrella institution. But as I mentioned, you will also end up facing the creator of the G virus, which ends up injected with it himself and starts mutating. And of course, that is the scientist William Birkin. Arguably, my personal favorite, probably creature, or up there with Nemesis. Arguably a fascinating creature and quite hard to kill, and as you face him multiple times, which would become a definite staple, especially coming into the next game with Nemesis. But Birkin is personal favorite character of mine. You would also, of course, chase after a little girl you would see in the police station. And of course, come to find out that is William Birkin's daughter, as well as you would see in the institution, you would also meet Birkin's wife. And one of the key things I love the most about Resident Evil 2 game is the fact that you have different ways you can play. Like, you can either play with Leon first and then Claire, or Claire first and Leon, because you have different scenarios how the story would play out differently depending on who you play first and then who you play second time around with. It is fascinating, and it's something I haven't really seen in any other Resident Evil game since. This is a key importance. Now, sadly, not so much does it work like that in the RE2 remake, unfortunately. But that's one of the things I like is how you could change scenarios and definitely gameplay elements from depending on what order you play with the characters. But for me, of course, my ultimate favorite location in the Resident Evil series pretty much will probably always be pretty much a deadlock between the mansion from Resident Evil 1 and, of course, the police station from RE2, though would also reappear briefly in Resident Evil 3 Nemesis as well. But with that said, overall, it is a great game, definitely a lot of dread, and I love the puzzle solving. It's one of the things I've always enjoyed about a lot of survival horror games, especially with Silent Hill, Resident Evil, though you would also see this in much earlier games like Clock Tower, or more specifically, Alone in the Dark. Definitely many things to keep in mind, definitely from the origins of survival horror, and this is what makes a true classic survival horror. A lot of people want to say they hate the uh, really bad, clunky control scheme, but that's kind of one of the elements that makes classic survival horror. And that's the thing, I'm glad to see at least some, like, indie horror games actually go back to that and readopt the clunky controls and stuff. Don't get me wrong, I get it. A lot of people really love, for instance, Resident Evil 4, which would go away from the tank controls. But at the same time, we lose a little bit of the soul that made Resident Evil Resident Evil, though at least 4 still felt like a Resident Evil game for the most part. I definitely can't say that about Resident Evil 5, was nothing but basically a third-person action game with the name Resident Evil attached, and Resident Evil 6 I would rather not even bring up. It's easily the worst Resident Evil game of all time, arguably. Or second worst. There is one other game I could say contend with it being worst of. But, with that said, there are many great games in the series, like Resident Evil Zero is underrated, and arguably probably the hardest difficulty out of the series, in my opinion. But RE2 did so many things excellent and well done that, in my opinion, no future Resident Evil game has ever been able to surpass Resident Evil 2, which is my number one favorite Resident Evil game of all time, arguably my top 5 favorite Capcom games of all time, if not top 3, and I would say for being it's probably my favorite survival horror game of all time, and very closely behind it would be Silent Hill. But with that said, hopefully you enjoyed the dark, eerie piano music I chose for this video. But look forward to some stuff I'm going to be uploading. My Silent Hill film review comes tomorrow. Let me know if maybe next year if you would like me to give a review on Resident Evil Apocalypse. But with that said, hopefully you enjoyed this brief little synopsis and some of my personal opinions. But overall, what do I grade Resident Evil 2? It shouldn't be a surprise. Resident Evil 2, I give it an A+. And a must-play classic, which you can get this on PSN for now, for PS3 as well as for Vita. And I recommend doing that while you can, especially since now you can't add funds to your accounts, which kind of sucks. But with that said, I'll see y'all next time. Stay safe and have a good and happy Halloween. And let me know if in the future you would like me to give my perspective as well as a basic review and my thoughts on some of the other games like the original Resident Evil 3 Nemesis, my personal second favorite, Code Veronica. But with that said, I'll see y'all next time. Stay safe out there in this crazy world we're in right now.